We'll get started in about 3 minutes, folks online and in person. We're just waiting for people to sneak on in, but I see you all on there. And for those of you here, recordings, I'm going to be continuing to work on posting. They've been too large to upload to Moodle, so I'm going to have to upload them to YouTube and then link them to our Moodle page. So those should be done today. I just haven't had time, but I will get the recordings up. I got like 5 emails. So we're going to get started today, and we're going to finish up on discussing the HPA-HPO axis. So kind of our last tail end of endocrine, and then we're going to move into the gut and the kidney for the rest of our discussion today. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time on HPA-HPO axis because there were some confusing pathways and structures and control systems. And there's 3 enzyme deficiencies that I want to hit on because they're likely to be tested in some capacity on NCLEX. You've seen even one of them on your practice exam. So I wanted to make sure that we covered this today. So this is the presentation for those of you who are online or in person. We're going to go through first is our HPA-HPO axis. So we remember, oops, let me see here. So you remember we have our 3 zones, our zona glomerulosa, our zona fasciculata, and our zona reticularis. And I'm going to be referencing these on the slides as ZG, ZF, and ZR. Okay, so I just want to give you some heads up. If you see a parenthesis with ZG, it's saying it's in the glomerulosa. If it says ZF, fasciculata, ZR, reticularis. If you see something that says PT, I believe that's the acronym I use for the abbreviation, that means peripheral tissue. So there are some of these androgen hormones that are, or some of these adrenal hormones that are converted in peripheral tissue. So that will hopefully kind of help you keep things in place as we go through. So our first, when we're thinking about synthesis of adrenal steroids, we're going to start up top with cholesterol. Cholesterol synthesized in the liver in the zona glomerulosa. Then we're going to transform cholesterol to pregnenolone. So those first 2 steps are universal throughout all of the different adrenal steroids that we will talk about today. From there, pregnenolone breaks off into 2 separate directions. One direction is going to make 17-hydroxypregnenolone, which is now in the zona fasciculata. See that ZF there? The other thing that pregnenolone will go transform into is progesterone, which is still in the glomerulosa. Progesterone then can also become 17-hydroxyprogesterone. So both pregnenolone and progesterone can become these 17-hydroxy forms of themselves. Both of those forms are now in the zona fasciculata instead of glomerulosa. The key piece here, why I'm having this slide up, is because it uses one of our key enzymes, which is 17-alpha hydroxylase. This is an enzyme that can be deficient in people, and we'll look at what that syndrome looks like. But it happens pretty high up top in adrenal synthesis, and it allows for only one pathway to actually to help continue to shunt through. So we'll look at what that is here, but I wanted you to see what this looks like. So if we're not able to use this enzyme, we're going to be stopping at pregnenolone and progesterone because we can't move down further. So let's look at what that deficiency appears to be. So deficiency of 17-alpha hydroxylase is going to stop that conversion of pregnenolone or progesterone to the 17-hydroxy forms of themselves. So what you'll have then is you'll have cholesterol becoming pregnenolone, maybe becoming progesterone, and then downstream will lead to aldosterone. And we'll look at that pathway next. But that's the only pathway that's not blocked by this 17-alpha hydroxylase deficiency. So there's only one direction for us to go. If you're creating cholesterol and you're moving down adrenal synthesis, you're going to move down into aldosterone because it's an aldosterone synthesis, because it's the only thing not blocked, okay? All of these steps will occur within the zona glomerulosa. Therefore, you're increasing your mineral corticoids, okay? That's the only area you're able to actually continue synthesis for. Your cortisol and your sex hormones then are decreased, okay? Cortisol in the fasciculata, sex hormones in reticularis. So those are both going to be decreased production of both cortisol and sex hormones with the deficiency of 17-alpha hydroxylase. Increased aldosterone is going to lead downstream effects to increased blood pressure, decreased potassium due to effects on the kidney itself. Those are going to be your downstream effects. You're going to have more aldosterone hanging out. You're going to have an increase in your blood pressure, because it's the only pathway you can shunt through in adrenal synthesis if you block this enzyme. Some clinical characteristics that you can see then is atypical genitalia or undescended testes, lack of secondary sexual development, because you're not forming those actual sex hormones. You could also see symptoms of adrenal insufficiency because you're not able to form cortisol. So that's your first deficiency. 17-alpha hydroxylase, again, you're able to make pregnenolone, make progesterone, and then you're blocked here at 17-alpha hydroxylase. You're not able to convert to that 17-hydroxy form of each. So the pathway that does move forward is progesterone to 11-deoxycorticosterone, corticosterone, and then aldosterone. So this is the pathway that's able to sneak through in a 17-alpha hydroxylase deficiency. So far, so good? That's our first deficiency. Two more. So I'll take note on this page here. I'm going to just point out two enzymes that we're going to talk about here shortly. So between progesterone and deoxycorticosterone, you see that we have our 21-hydroxylase enzyme here. And then between 11-deoxycorticosterone and corticosterone, we have our 11-beta hydroxylase. So we will talk about both of these deficiencies here next. But 21-hydroxylase is what we'll hit on first. So one of its points that it helps convert is progesterone to 11-deoxycorticosterone in this zona glomerulosa. The other area where it affects is when we start looking at the fasciculata. So now we're in the next area of tissue. We have our 17-hydroxypregnenolone and our 17-hydroxyprogesterone. This can be formed again from pregnenolone itself directly. This can be formed from progesterone itself directly, right? But 17-hydroxypregnenolone can also become 17-hydroxyprogesterone. So there are some interconversions available in this adrenal synthesis pathway. So why when you look at one of these full schemas in one page, it can get really confusing because you have arrows going in every which direction, which is why I broke it down into just little sizable chunks. From there, your 17-hydroxyprogesterone is going to use that 21-hydroxylase, which we're going to talk about here in a second, to become 11-deoxycortisol. This is all in the zona fasciculata. So this enzyme, 21-hydroxylase, affects the glomerulosa as well as fasciculata tissues. From there, 11-deoxycortisol is going to use 11-beta-hydroxylase, another enzyme we'll talk about in a minute, to become cortisol. And then cortisol becomes inactive when it turns into cortisone. So let's look first at what deficiency of 21-hydroxylase would look like. So we have two places that are going to be blocked. Again, progesterone to deoxycorticosterone and hydroxyprogesterone to deoxycortisol. Two separate areas that are using this enzyme. So when we have a deficiency in 21-hydroxylase, it's going to stop that conversion of progesterone to 11-deoxycorticosterone. It's also going to stop the conversion of 17-hydroxyprogesterone to 11-deoxycortisol. So it's going to stop one pathway in the glomerulosa and one pathway in the fasciculata. So what can happen still then? Well, cholesterol can still become pregnenolone and progesterone, so we can still have that. It can still become 17-hydroxypregnenolone and 17-hydroxyprogesterone. And from there, the only pathway available, which I'll show you here in a minute, is our DHEA and androstenedione, so our sex hormone pathway. So in this deficiency, 21-hydroxylase, we've blocked the pathway to go to aldosterone, we've blocked the pathway to go to cortisol, but we allow our sex hormones to go forward. So that's the major difference between deficiency in 21-hydroxylase versus deficiency in 17-alpha hydroxylase. Remember, 17-alpha hydroxylase, we only have the aldosterone pathway available to us. So the only area that's allowed to go forward in 21-hydroxylase deficiency is in the reticularis. So we're going to see increased androgens. So our glucocorticoids and our mineralocorticoids will be decreased in this deficiency. We love asking questions about these. That's why I'm belaboring them a little bit, because they're very, very good test questions. They can ask a lot of different things. They can bring in congenital conditions, they can bring in hormones, they can bring in biochemistry, physiology, anatomy. So as a test question writer, right, we get into their head a little bit. This is a great place to be able to try to ask a bunch of different questions on a lot of different things. Correct. You're going to have low aldosterone and low blood pressure. Your potassium is actually going to increase, the opposite of 17-alpha hydroxylase. Because when we had 17-alpha hydroxylase deficiency, we had an increase in blood pressure and we had a decrease in potassium. So we have the opposite effect because we have low aldosterone in this case. So the opposite effect is true. Clinical characteristics, the most common presentation is salt wasting, but you can see other things too. Obviously, you're going to not have cortisol around. So again, adrenal insufficiency type symptoms can occur, but you're not going to see changes to sex characteristics because you do have your androgens. You are able to make estrogen, DHEA, testosterone if you have a deficiency in 21-hydroxylase. 21-hydroxylase deficiency is the most common of these three deficiencies. So if you were to see one the most commonly, it would be this one. Again, we blocked here and we blocked here. So far, so good?
Dr. Pacho, could you provide an example of a question that might include the deficiencies of the enzymes? Thank you.
Yeah, I will. I'm gonna answer this question in class 2 though first. I know, it's the voice from above. I love it. What were you saying? Sorry. Yes, there are names that are associated with these different conditions, but when they're presented to you on the NPLEX, they will say deficiency in this enzyme. Yes, this is actually one area where they will list the enzyme and say, there's a deficiency in this enzyme, 21-alpha or 21-hydroxylase or 17-alpha or 11-beta. What does that mean? So an example question would be, your case vignette might be for this one, A 22-year-old male presents to, or is in your clinic. They're hypotensive and they have a history, or you find out on history that they present with a 21 or 21 hydroxylase deficiency. Would you expect to see them have hypokalemia and increase, or hypokalemia and low cortisol, hypokalemia and high cortisol, hyperkalemia and low cortisol, hyperkalemia and high cortisol? That's probably how they'll ask these questions. They'll give you those four options, 2 options of each, and you have a 50, or I guess a 25% shot if you don't know what you're looking for. So knowing what would happen to BP, cortisol, androgens, potassium, those would be your main areas you want to track for each of these deficiencies, which is why I'm trying to list that on your slides for you. They could also ask, at the kidney, if aldosterone is deficient in this condition, downstream effects on kidney, which we are going to talk kidney today, so we'll get to that. Or they might say if cortisol is deficient or in excess, what could that do? What would that relationship be maybe to the sympathetic nervous system or autonomic nervous system? Would that have any effect at all? Or what would that do with salt wasting? Salt increase, salt decrease? Those are good questions. If it's androgen related, they might ask if it's the previous one or 17 alpha hydroxylase. They might ask about DHEA or testosterone or estrogen or even progesterone. We remember progesterone won't be affected in any of these in theory, right? We're still able to convert to progesterone. So in theory, all these people could have a normal progesterone level, or at least they could create and produce progesterone. It's going to be downstream effects of estrogen and testosterone that get affected. So that's where, voice from above, that's where I think they would likely hit you with questions on these.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. They probably won't care as much about each individual intermediate. I doubt they would ask you about, there's one intermediate they'll ask you about and we'll get to. But most of the intermediates here, they will care about the big ones: cortisol, progesterone, pregnenolone, cholesterol, those type of intermediates. And our last one we're going to look at, and I'll get to your question, the 11 beta hydroxylase is different, and there's a reason why, and it's an intermediate. And so that's why there will be one intermediate that they will likely ask you about if they go there. Yes. Would there be deficiencies in aldosterone synthase or just aldosterone itself? Is that what you're asking? So it wouldn't necessarily affect the enzyme of aldosterone synthase unless if it needed aldosterone to create aldosterone synthase. So if aldosterone is a part of that structure, then yes. If aldosterone synthase is its own protein that's made itself, it wouldn't necessarily be deficient on its own, but the process to move to aldosterone wouldn't occur because you don't have the precursor, the substrate, prior to get to aldosterone. So the issue isn't having these, this is the enzyme that's affected, right? 21 hydroxylase. This enzyme here, or this enzyme here, that's why I'm not even listing them, they're not affected by these deficiencies. What is affected though is if you can't move forward with this pathway, you don't have these actual substrates to then push down to the products. If you had those substrates, if you were able to do a workaround, if you were able to somehow exogenously administer corticosteroid for this patient, then they could do the conversion to aldosterone. So some treatments for people, if they're not able to give the direct enzymes, some treatments could be, are we able to give them a precursor further down in the pathway that then they can convert on their own? So while you can treat the adrenal insufficiency for these people by giving them exogenous cortisone or cortisol, because then they're able to still produce, they're able to at least use it, right? You could, in theory, for the initial one, your 17 alpha hydroxylase, you could give someone exogenous testosterone or estrogen to then develop those secondary sex characteristics, or even do a DHEA and then let them self-convert, because it's that first step that they're deficient in that pathway. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, absolutely. So then we just looked at 21 hydroxylase deficiency, and we kind of talked about how it's a little bit, at least when it comes to blood pressure effects, it's the opposite of what we're seeing with our alpha. So now what we're going to do is look at the opposite. Look at the set 11 beta hydroxylase. And this is what we had an exam question on, I believe. Yes? No, maybe so. So then we look at this 11 beta hydroxylase enzyme, and we see that in this first pathway here in the glomerulosa, it's going to stop us from going from deoxycorticosterone to corticosterone. So this is the pathway here that we're going to be stopped at. Then when we look over here at our next little schema, we see that we're stopping this time from deoxycortisol to cortisol. So we're making the precursors for these final steps, but not the final step. How does this actually affect our body? So when we're stopping the conversion of 11-deoxycorticosterone to corticosterone, and we're stopping the conversion of 11-deoxycortisol to cortisol, we'll see again, cholesterol is going to be shunted to pregnenolone and progesterone. It'll make the 17-hydroxy forms. It's starting to become routine, right? We've done it a couple times. Then we're going to be able to form DHEA and androgens, and we'll have an increase in our sex hormones. So we're going to be mainly shunting down that pathway, but not everything is exactly the same as our 21 hydroxylase deficiency, and this is why. So again, all the regions that we're still pushing the pathway through is through the reticularis, so androgens are increased. Therefore, we're going to see cortisol and aldosterone be decreased still in this pathway. But this one's different because blood pressure increases in deficiency of 11 beta hydroxylase, which is super confusing. It's like, why? The reason why is 11-deoxycorticosterone actually causes blood pressure increasing abilities similar to aldosterone without the direct effects on kidney metabolism with ions. So what you're going to see is you're going to see elevated blood pressure in this condition with still low potassium. So we saw last time with our other issue that had blood pressure elevated, right? We saw again, when we were working with deficiency of 17-alpha hydroxylase, we saw an elevated blood pressure and we saw hypokalemia with that condition because we were bumping aldosterone up that time. This time, we don't bump aldosterone up. We've stopped the pathway right here, but deoxycorticosterone could still have similar effects on blood pressure and potassium wasting. So it's going to still increase our blood pressure. It's going to still lower potassium. And that's the biggest difference between 21 hydroxylase deficiency, which has a low BP and an increase in potassium, versus 11 beta hydroxylase deficiency, which has a high BP and a low potassium. And it's all because you still have some aldosterone-like effects from that 11-deoxycorticosterone. It's not the same as aldosterone, so it's not going to do the exact same thing, but that's why you see an increase in blood pressure. And if you're looking in the NCLEX or the USMLE book, it'll give you a table, and this is what we were talking about yesterday. And that's when I got it, I was like, oh, she's gonna be excited. But it'll give you this table and it'll list these things, and that's why, but it doesn't tell you it's because it's intermediate. So if you're asked about one intermediate, it would likely be this one. That isn't like a normal hormone or normal steroid that we would be familiar with. The reason for the lowered potassium is there's less renin due to increased blood pressure. So your renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system is not activated because your blood pressure is high. So the body's not going to activate that system when BP is elevated. So that's actually the MOA that leads to that lower potassium. So with this deficiency, you can actually see severe hypertension in childhood. So if you had early on elevated blood pressure as a kid, this could be a secondary cause of hypertension. And again, we're still also seeing elevation in our androgen hormones. So now what do androgen synthesis look like? So now we move over from the fasciculata to the reticularis, and then I have two peripheral tissue. That's what PT means. So not physical therapy, but peripheral tissue. So our 17-hydroxypregnenolone and our 17-hydroxyprogesterone, again, Pregnenolone can become progesterone here. Those are going to both be in the fasciculata. When they are converted to either DHEA or androstenedione, that's when we move from the fasciculata to the reticularis. That's when that conversion occurs. So DHEA can become DHEAS. DHEA can also become that androstenedione, which is our precursor to either testosterone or estrone. Testosterone forms still in the reticularis. Estrone to estradiol, these conversions occur in peripheral tissue. And so when I'm talking about androgen pathways, that's what I'm referring to. And we can see the whole meal deal here. This is a little bit of a different schema than what you'll see in your USMLE books. I like it because it kind of lists things out. It's repetitive. It's going to include things more than one time, but it separates them into tissue areas. So you have your glomerulosa, you can see cholesterol, pregnenolone, and you can see our different conversion factors that we talked about. So there's one of our enzymes, the 21. There's the 11. And then we can go find, where's our other one that we're looking for? 21, 11, and 17. Where's my 17? 11 beta. Oop. 17 hydroxylase. Yeah. 17 and 17. I think that's all of them. I might have missed one somewhere, but I tried to hit them all. I think I circled more than what's there. But what I like about this one is you can go through and kind of match what I showed you, and on these pathways you have it separated into tissue types, and you have your end outcomes here at the bottom. Again, DHEA, DHEAS. They don't go to testosterone on this one, or estrone or estradiol. So that's the only thing I don't like about this pathway. Questions about adrenal hormone synthesis? Questions, comments, concerns? More concerns. Okay, what was concerning? What still is not kind of clicking, or is it just committing it to your brain? Committing it to you. So what I would really focus on, again, is cholesterol, pregnenolone, and then your three different options: aldosterone, cortisol, or your sex hormones, right? Testosterone, estrogen. Know those three categories: glomerulosa for aldosterone, fasciculata for your cortisol, and reticularis for your androgens. Once you have that separated in your brain, then you don't need to necessarily know the specific step that's going to be blocked, except for our deficiency where we have our funny little 11 beta hydroxylase. That's the only one that you really need to know that specific place where it's blocked, because the place where it's blocked has our funny intermediate that actually can contribute to blood pressure. Everything else, you just need to know which ones are going to increase aldosterone versus which ones are going to increase androgens. All of them across the board are going to block cortisol. So all three of them are stopping cortisol synthesis. Great. So that happens for all three. You're going to have aldosterone decreasing for all but the first. Aldosterone increases for 17 alpha, but decreases for the other two. And then you're going to have androgens are going to decrease for 17 alpha, and then they're going to increase for the other two. So androgens and aldosterone are doing the opposite thing. Yeah. Yeah. So it could contribute to a secondary cause of Addison's, absolutely. So adrenal insufficiency or true Addison's disease could potentially be caused, and etiology could be a deficiency in one of these enzymes. So it could be more of a primary cause because it's congenital versus a secondary acquired cause later on in life. Absolutely. Yeah. So when they say genetic causes, right, these would be some of the genetic causes that could contribute to an Addison's disease, a true adrenal insufficiency. Not where we talk about like symptoms of adrenal fatigue, but like a true adrenal insufficiency, Addison, could be caused by a deficiency in one of these enzymes. And again, treatments, you could think about, they might ask questions of, if you gave someone exogenous cortisol, even though we're not treating things, they sometimes like to ask these questions. What would you expect to happen? And if you gave someone exogenous cortisol, you wouldn't see the effects of the adrenal fatigue or the adrenal insufficiency or Addison's, but you might not see improvements in those other areas. So they'd be looking for something like, would blood pressure change? Would it still be increased or decreased? Would you still see hyperandrogenism or low androgens? So those would be how they would fit in those type of questions. It wouldn't matter if you're giving them cortisol or not, if you're giving them testosterone or not. They're really looking to see your understanding of the condition as a whole. So remember, this isn't a treatment. So anytime they throw a treatment out there, it's going to be either a major detractor and it won't matter in your answer, or like we saw with glycyrrhiza, and when they talked about spironolactone, it might be a hidden helper if you know what they're talking about. But you shouldn't have to know treatment for this test. Okay. All right, I'm gonna pop this one off. This was a short and sweet to get us going in the morning. We're gonna do digestion next. This one's longer. So I have two kind of major path systems and then my kidney PowerPoint, I put all of my kidney stuff. There's like 3 or 4 presentations in one PDF for y'all. But for digestion, this is going to be more of an overview of our important products of mastication, digestion, assimilation, all those good stuff. And then we're going to go into the specific secretory components and where they're housed and what they do. Those are probably the 2 major areas in the gut that they'll get you physiologically or even with path, is they want to know, do you understand the process from chewing food all the way down? And can you connect that to carbohydrate, protein, and lipid assimilation and absorption? So this is a great place for them to ask you some hidden biochem questions, or even just understanding knowledge about how to apply some of the secretory components of the gut to these different processes of absorption and nutrient deficiency. So we'll get going on this, and then at around 8:50, I'll give you your first breaks in about 20 minutes. So in its basic form, definition of digestion, set of biochemical reactions where food's converted into molecules and they're manipulated into biologically useful stuff. So thinking about pizza. Pizza has protein, it has fat, it has carbs. You're going to have proteins digested into amino acids by proteolytic enzymes, proteases. Those are secreted by stomach and pancreas. You're going to have your carbs like polysaccharides and starch are cleaved to become monosaccharides by alpha amylase, secreted by the saliva and the pancreas. And lipids are converted into fatty acids by lipases secreted by the pancreas. This is if you can only commit one thing to your brain about the gut, at least understand this slide, okay? Will you need to know more detail? Absolutely. But at least if you can start here, you'll be on the right track. I say all here, but nothing is all. I would probably say most, but for simplicity's sake, all digestive enzymes are hydrolases, so they cleave by adding a molecule of water. This will be most enzymes that we're going to talk about and discuss are hydrolases. They're going to cleave stuff by adding water. So the majority of your digestive enzymes, proteases, lipases, amylase, are going to be secreted as inactive forms. There's one that doesn't. The one that's secreted as in its active state. The inactive forms are called zymogens or proenzymes. So if I'm referring to something as a zymogen or proenzyme, I'm talking about its inactive form. There's some type of conversion step that has to take place for it to become active. This is typically proteolytic cleavage, activates the next set of enzymes. This infamously happens down in our pancreas, small intestine, which we'll get to. Prior to secretion, though, zymogens are just hanging out in granules near the cell membrane, in that brush border, waiting to be released, to be stimulated. Oftentimes, a pH change is going to stimulate release, or potentially an actual chemoreceptor or a pressure receptor. Granules then fuse with cell membrane and release things into the lumen. I think I have this later, but alpha amylase is the one that's secreted in its active form. It's not secreted as a zymogen. So if you're a table type person and like to see things in a simple, straightforward way, when we're talking about some of these digestive enzymes, we have site of synthesis, so stomach and pancreas for these. We have the zymogen form and the active enzyme form. So pepsinogen becomes pepsin, chymotrypsinogen becomes chymotrypsin. You start seeing a pattern here, right? Trypsinogen, trypsin. Carbopeptidase is weird. It's procarbopeptidase, so it's more of a proenzyme. And then pro-elastase becomes elastase. And you can see the activator. So in the stomach, pepsin becomes activated from itself. From low pH in the stomach, it can self-activate. Then you see 3 of them are activated by trypsin itself. So chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and elastase are all activated by trypsin, which we'll talk about. We'll break that down. And then enteropeptidase activates our trypsinogen 2-trypsin on small intestine epithelial cells. So if you have an issue with trypsin, you're going to have an issue with all of your digestive enzymes coming from your pancreas. Okay, that makes sense. We can start thinking about how could some deficiencies or how could some metabolic pathways cause downstream disease or pathology. So when in doubt, if something's going on with trypsin or that trypsinogen to trypsin conversion, you're going to have issues digesting things that the pancreas digests. Pancreas digestion helps with a lot of breakdown of things, but especially fat and carbohydrates. Helps finish that process. Yeah. With exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, yeah, you have issues with trypsin. You can also have issues with other pancreatic enzymes as well. But one of the measurements is chymotrypsin. It's one of the things that we will measure actually in the blood, and elastase. I think we measure elastase in the stool too. But yes, you will have an issue with potentially activation, so trypsinogen to trypsin, or you have an issue with trypsin actually being able to activate the rest of your enzyme cascade. Yeah. So again, our exception to the rule of proenzymes is alpha amylase, because alpha amylase is secreted in the saliva, active, starts carbohydrate breakdown. It's also secreted from the pancreas in its active form. So it's not a zymogen. So when in doubt, this is a great test question, right? Something that's not like the others. Ooh, fun. Which of these is not, it does not have a zymogen form, or which of these is activated without, I don't know, some other activation? I can't think of a good test question, but it would be a great test question to write. So digestion, so going through these processes, it's a big part of your NPLEX study guide. I think we're going through 6, 7, 8, and maybe a little bit of 9 today on your gastro study guide. So digestion starts in the mouth. So chewing is your first step, mastication is your first step of digestion. You're going to turn the food from solid to partially liquid state. And this also makes digestive enzymes have an easier time because of increased surface area. So that's the big thing that mastication is allowing you to do, is increasing surface area and binding capacity of whatever food you're going to put into your body. You also have this process a little bit in the stomach with the churning process that goes on in the stomach itself. But again, this is just increasing surface area to increase binding, and also to start breaking down some of these larger molecules into things that are smaller. So the body has to do less work with its enzymes. So what's saliva doing? So salivary glands secreting saliva. Saliva does contain alpha amylase. It also contains other mucoproteins that can homogenize food and provide that extra lubrication to swallow. So we can think about states where you might have a decrease in saliva production, having an increase or an issue in carbohydrate digestion and absorption. What's one of our conditions that we can think of that has an issue with saliva production? Sjogren's, that's the one that comes to my mind first too, absolutely. So Sjogren's syndrome, decreased salivary production, decreased amylase production in the mouth. Amylase in the mouth doesn't do a ton of carb breakdown, but it does help that process get started. So then the body's going to have to do more work when it gets to the stomach and the pancreas. So long-term effects, if the pancreas is working harder, you could potentially see issues downstream with pancreatic insufficiency or pancreatic overworking. You can have problems with actual absorption then of nutrients. And so downstream effects is important with anything we're talking about with the gut. Alpha amylase specifically cleaves alpha-1,4 glycosidic bonds. So that's how it's a carb breakdowner. And it's very limited polysaccharide breakdown. So then we're going to talk a little bit about the protein then, because once we get food into the stomach, that's really where protein breakdown starts. There's no protein breakdown that happens in the mouth outside of just mastication. So we're going to talk a little bit about stomach acid and pepsins. So digestion then moves to our stomach. Proteins are denatured by that acidic environment of the stomach. The pH is 1 to 2 in the stomach, right? Our proteins, if we think about proteins, they're made up of building blocks, which are amino acids. Amino acids have a carboxylic and an amine group on either end. When you stick an amino acid into a really acidic environment, what's going to happen to it? So if you have, I'll do this way. So you have COO on one end, you have a carbon here and an R group and an H, and then you have an NH3 plus on this end. This is in pH of 7.4, right? So this is a normal amino acid, and remember, proteins are just building blocks. This is bound to this, and then so on and so forth, and this is bound to this, and so they're in their long chain. That's the primary structure of a protein, right? Long amino acid chain. So if we stick this, if we change pH of 7.4 to a pH of 1 to 2, what will happen when it's in an acidic environment? Denature, yes, but how? What's happening on this level? Yes, peptide bond is cleaving. And what's happening is we're going to put hydrogens on everything, right? Because we're in an acidic environment. So everything gets hydrogens. We all get hydrogens. That's part of what helps cleave and denature the peptide bond, because the bond itself, it's broken. It's a tight bond that breaks with acid. But we're then going to, if you have free amino acids, they're going to be more of their acidic states. They're all going to have hydrogens on them when you're in an acid state. If you're in a basic state, they're all going to lose their hydrogens, right? They're going to give up their protons. Okay, so proteins denature in acidic environment. It was ionic and hydrogen bonds are broken due to low pH. I even wrote it on here, y'all. All right, so ionic and hydrogen bonds are broken due to low pH. So our primary, our secondary, our tertiary, our quaternary structures start to break down. Proteolytic enzymes pepsin also start working on those proteins in the stomach. Pepsin breaks those proteins into these smaller digestible fragments. We'll talk about all these different digestive enzymes. A whole table for you. It's gonna be a super joy. All right, so quick aside, stomach acid. We need it. We like to block it in medicine, but we need it. Gastric proton pump, hydrogen, potassium, ATPase. It does use energy. It's located on those cells lining the stomach. It's similar to our sodium potassium ATPase pump that we've discussed in the past. So super common pump, very similar process, right? We exchange some potassium and hydrogen and we make things more acidic. Pumps protons into the stomach in exchange for potassium with the cost of ATPs. This is an energy using process. And our stomach exists in an acidic state pretty constantly unless if we change it. So then from the stomach, we do some churning, we do some protein breakdown, we throw some acid on it and we see what happens. And then we move into the small intestine through that pyloric sphincter. I do have a picture coming up. Once we're in the small intestine with proteins, we're talking about protein digestion. Partially digested proteins, carbs, and lipids are going to move from that acidic stomach into the small intestine via the pyloric sphincter. When that happens, there is some acidic contents that do enter into the small intestine, and that's going to trigger, we'll see, some of the release of our digestive cascade later on. Because typically the small intestine is in an acidic or more of an alkaline state. More alkaline, it's more back to our normal physiologic pH, right? Closer to 7.4, our small intestine. So then once acid gets entered into there, there's chemoreceptors and pH receptors that say, hey, oh, stomach contents are entered. I need to now release my digestive enzymes. Secretin is the hormone that they release first. Secretin promotes the release of bicarb from the pancreas to neutralize the acidity so you don't have caustic damage to the tissue. So we do see some bicarb buffer coming into play. And then the polypeptide products of pepsin, let's say that 3 times fast, from the stomach, stimulate that release of cholecystokinin, CCK hormone, by intestinal cells, which the pancreas then responds to that CCK by releasing its digestive cascade of enzymes. That continues protein digestion, and it's going to start, and I say start, the digestion of lipids, and we'll say continue/start digestion of carbs, because we had a little bit carb breakdown in the mouth, but not a lot. So what does that look like? picture-wise if you're visual. Food goes in, proteins, hydrochloric acid, pepsin. We have oligopeptides in the stomach. We then are going to move into from here. That's pyloric sphincter. We're going to move into our small intestine where digestive enzymes are released from our pancreas. Bicarb, secretin, CCK. We can see some of those feedback loops. So oligopeptides increase secretin, which increases pancreatic release. Initial kind of digestive products and acid encourages CCK, which then also increases pancreatic release. And CCK also is going to stimulate the gallbladder to release some bile. This is some of our feedback loops. And then the final act of protein digestion is our pancreatic proteases are going to hydrolyze our proteins into our final oligopeptides. Peptidases finish the job, and they're actually attached externally to intestinal cells. They're going to cleave those final oligopeptides into our amino acids, our building blocks, and a few di and tripeptides. So it's pretty much the smallest of the small protein components. They're then transported into our intestinal cells via our transporters. There's 7 different types of transporters specific to amino acid groups. You don't need to know them for the exam. Don't put them to memory. But know that specific amino acids are transported through specific amino acid transporters. So there is some specificity to it. So if you had a deficiency in a certain amino acid, or if you're having trouble absorbing a certain amino acid, I would look at that transporter and say, is there a condition or is there a state that maybe that part of my stomach is damaged or part of that lining is damaged to the point that I'm not able to absorb, let's say alanine, because my alanine transporter is broken. Okay. Could think of that from a specific biochemical reason, or you could think of it as what are some reasons where we might see damage to the structure of the small intestine? What are some conditions where we might see some damage? Throw them out there. I know you know them. SIBO, great. What else? Think along that lines, but food, sensitivity or allergy. An intolerance, what's a specific one? Celiac, yeah, great. What else? IBS, maybe some inflammatory state potentially, yeah. Can affect more of the upper gut versus the lower gut. Small intestine versus large intestine. Good. Those are things that, sorry, maybe peptic ulcer disease. If you're having an ulcer around the pyloric sphincter in that small intestine, right? Not actually in the stomach. You can have ulcers in the small intestine. You can have a duodenal ulcer. So if that tissue is ulcerated, you've broken off that tissue, you're not having as many receptors. Maybe then that scars, that tissue is actually dead. It's not functional tissue anymore. So thinking about these pathologies, again, I don't want you to feel like you've memorized anything. If you understand certain physiologic components of how the body works when it's going right, and you know in general a definition of a condition, you can go down the road and say, okay, well, if this is an inflammatory condition that's going to destroy part of the small intestine or affect the small intestine, what happens in the small intestine? And then from there, you can start seeing some of the long-term pathological effects without memorizing. Just being able to reason it away. That's how as doctors, that's how you seem to know so much, right? I mean, Google and UpToDate help because we look up things all the time. But it's not because we memorize every single medical condition. I would go crazy. It's just because we're thinking from a physiologic and biochemical standpoint and then saying, okay, what does this condition do to the body physiologically? How does it change normal to not normal? And then from there, you can figure out symptoms and you can figure out pathological pathogenesis over time. And then there's those weird conditions you have to memorize because they're weird. All right, I want to get through this and then I have a gluten slide and then we'll break for a minute. All right, then once we have amino acids uptake, then they're released into the bloodstream by antiporters. They go throughout the body and they're used to either be built up to proteins or specifically for any reactions that need those specific amino acids. So an aside on gluten, celiac disease. So the gluten or no gluten, the eternal question. Every patient I see, oh, I know I shouldn't be eating gluten. I'm like, well, no, you might be fine to eat gluten. Not everyone needs to stop eating it. But if you have celiac disease, you should not. Celiac disease is the inability to digest certain proteins at its core. Celiac disease is a gluten enteropathy. Intestinal inflammatory disease triggered by proteins in wheat, rye, barley. The protein is gliadin and glutenin in wheat, and saccharin in barley and rye. They're all rich in proline and glutamine. So that's interesting. So you already have some amino acid components. You can have some cross reactivity then to something else that's high in proline and glutamine, especially if you continue to have the assault of gluten and you don't know that you're celiac positive. It's resistant to complete digestion by pepsin and pancreatic proteases. So you have a breakdown in your protein digestion with both the stomach and the pancreas. And then you'll have an inflammatory response. Genetics plays a role. And you have actual damage to your intestinal epithelial cells. You have an inability to not only absorb things like proteins and amino acids now, but other nutrients, because most of our nutrients are absorbed, as we'll see, in the small intestine. It's actually more common than we think. But I put this here because there is actually a pathological change in celiac disease with that healthy villi tissue. You see villi blunting here. And the less surface area you have on your intestinal mucosa, the less you're going to be able to absorb stuff, right? That's why we have these beautiful villi, because they can grab and bind to a bunch of things. The less we have, the less we absorb. And so downstream effects of absorption, all your macromolecules, and then most of your vitamins. B12, iron, a lot of these things you can see deficient in someone with untreated celiac. This same thing can be applied, like I mentioned, to anything that's going to affect that surface area of the intestinal mucosa, specifically in small intestine, right? I'm not going to do villi blunting necessarily, but if you're seeing an ulcer and then dead scar tissue, that's also going to decrease absorption, especially if it's in a certain area. Okay. All right, we're going to take a 6-minute break. Then we'll come back and do carbs and fats. And then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of all of those different secretory components. So 6 minutes, stand, get some water, whatever you need. Online folks, I'm going to stop recording for a minute and turn off my mic, and then we'll be back at 9 o'clock.